Right now, a pickup truck built in China is being loaded onto ships bound for Mexico, Brazil, Thailand, and Australia. It looks almost uncannily like a Ford. Right now, Chinese battery makers control more than 70% of the entire global electric vehicle battery supply chain, a share so dominant that South Korean and Japanese rivals are posting losses just trying to compete. Right now, more than 200 Chinese EV models sell for under $25,000, some for as little as $10,000. And right now, the one vehicle segment America has protected behind a 60-year-old tariff wall, the one category where Detroit has never had to seriously compete on price or innovation, has a predator circling it in markets the United States doesn't control. This video is about that last fortress, why it exists, and why the wall around it may not hold everywhere it counts. This isn't speculation about some distant future. The reporting behind this comes from CNBC, NBC News, and the Detroit News, along with market data from SNE Research, a South Korean firm that tracks global battery installations, and statements directly from Ford CEO Jim Farley and Toyota Chairman Akio Toyoda. The truck at the center of this story, BYD's Shark, is a real, currently shipping product, not a prototype or rumor. Sales in Mexico alone have been strong enough that BYD is now localizing production entirely in Thailand, betting on years of sustained demand rather than a short-lived launch. To understand why its arrival matters so much, you first need to understand what makes this one category of vehicle different from every other battleground in the global auto industry. Because the story of how America built this fortress starts 60 years ago, and it starts, unbelievably, with chickens. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson was looking for a way to retaliate after France, and West Germany imposed tariffs on American poultry exports. His response was a 25% tariff on a handful of European goods, including brandy, potato starch, and, almost as an afterthought, light-duty trucks. Most of those retaliatory tariffs eventually disappeared. The one on trucks never did. 60 years later, that tariff, nicknamed the chicken tax, still applies, and it has quietly become one of the most consequential pieces of trade policy in American industrial history. Think of it like a moat dug around a single castle while the rest of the kingdom was left completely open. Cars imported into the U.S. face a tariff of just 2.5%. Pickup trucks assembled outside North America face 10 times that. The practical effect has been almost total. For 6 decades, no foreign automaker has been able to profitably sell a full-size pickup truck in the United States without building it on American, Canadian, or Mexican soil first. The tariff didn't just block foreign trucks outright either. It spawned decades of increasingly inventive workarounds. The kind of thing that only happens when a single number on a customs form is worth tens of thousands of dollars per vehicle. In the years after the tax took hold, Japanese manufacturers began exporting entire light trucks with the cargo bed left off, since the bed alone qualified for a far lower tariff rate. The truck bed would then get bolted onto the finished chassis once it reached American soil, a loophole that survived until regulators finally closed it in 1980. Subaru, facing the same wall, reportedly outfitted small pickup beds with plastic folding seats and rear windows so the vehicles could be classified as passenger cars rather than trucks, then had dealers physically remove the seats before handing the keys to buyers. Ford, for its own commercial vans, has been known to import them fully finished with rear windows installed, then strip those windows out once. The vehicles cleared customs. None of these workarounds were subtle, and none of them fundamentally challenged the wall itself. They were the kind of elaborate, expensive detours businesses only bother inventing when the alternative, actually competing on price inside the protected category, simply isn't an option. That history matters here because it shows how seriously foreign automakers have always taken this one American market, and how consistently they've chosen to engineer around the tariff rather than challenge it directly. BYD, notably, hasn't bothered with any of that. It hasn't tried shipping the Shark in pieces or disguising it as something else. It has simply gone around the wall entirely, into markets where no wall exists at all. Inside that walled-off American market, the stakes couldn't be higher for Detroit. Specifically, full-size trucks now represent the most profitable vehicles Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis sell, and pickups collectively account for more than half of all U.S. vehicle sales in most years, an extraordinary concentration for a single vehicle category. The Ford F-Series has been America's best-selling vehicle for decades running. Analysts and industry officials have said openly that if the chicken tax were ever lifted, it could put a serious dent in Detroit's earnings because the segment provides the big three with something close to all of their real profit margin. Everything else in the American auto industry, sedans, hatchbacks, even most SUVs, has been exposed to genuine foreign competition for generations. Pickup trucks were the one category that never had to prove itself against the rest of the world, because the rest of the world was never legally allowed to show up and compete on price. Here's the part that connects this old tariff wall to what's happening globally right now. The wall only protects the American market. It does nothing outside U.S. borders, and outside U.S. borders is exactly where the profit pool for pickup trucks has always extended into Mexico, Australia, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Ford's F-Series dominates domestically, but Toyota's Hilux has been the top-selling truck outside North America for years, with nearly 20 million units sold globally since 1968. This international pickup market, worth billions of dollars annually, has always been something American and Japanese manufacturers competed for freely on relatively equal footing, without any equivalent of the chicken tax protecting anyone. That is precisely the market BYD entered when it launched the Shark. It is a mid-size plug-in hybrid pickup, meaning it runs on a battery but carries a small gasoline engine to extend its range, addressing one of the biggest hesitations global truck buyers have historically had about going fully electric. Without the branding badge, industry reporters covering its unveiling noted, the Shark could pass for an American product, its exterior styling drawing visible comparison to Ford's own lineup. BYD has made no announcement about bringing the Shark into the United States, where the chicken tax would make it commercially unworkable anyway. Instead, it has gone directly into the same countries where Ford, Toyota, and General Motors have built their global truck business for decades. Mexico, Australia, and increasingly Thailand, where BYD is localizing production entirely. Jim Farley, Ford's own CEO, was asked directly about the Shark and didn't dismiss it. He called it a great product, noted it was selling well in high volumes in Mexico, and said that if Ford wants to remain a global player in pickups, it has to compete. Toyota's chairman, Akio Toyoda, gave a similarly unguarded response when asked about the growing Chinese threat, saying the company needs to be prepared to respond to the demands of global markets, regardless of where the competition comes from. Neither executive framed this as a hypothetical. Both were describing a competitor already inside markets their companies have relied on for real profit for decades. To picture the scale of what BYD is actually capable of doing to a market like this, it helps to compare it on two different axes at once. First, in raw growth. In the 2010s, China exported roughly 1 million vehicles a year across all categories. By 2025, that number had exploded to 7.1 million, and Chinese automakers are targeting 10 million exports for 2026 alone. Second, in time, it took Toyota, one of the most successful automakers in history, from 1957 to 2001, 44 years, to reach 10% market share in the United States. It took Hyundai 26 years to hit that same benchmark. Chinese EV exports have gone from a rounding error to tens of millions of vehicles globally in barely a decade, a pace of expansion that makes even Toyota and Hyundai's historically fast climbs look gradual by comparison. Quickly, before going further, what you now know is that a single 60-year-old tariff created the most profitable, least competitive corner of the American auto industry, that this protection only ever applied within U.S. borders, and that BYD has now placed a truck engineered specifically for that same segment directly into the international markets Ford and Toyota have relied on for decades to make up the difference. Now here's where the story widens out, because the truck itself is really just the visible tip of something much larger happening underneath the entire global EV industry. The reason Chinese EVs, trucks included, can undercut competitors so consistently on price isn't primarily government subsidies, even though that's the explanation most commonly repeated in American political debate. According to an analysis from the research firm Rhodium Group, subsidies account for only about 5% of the actual cost gap between Chinese and Western EVs. The rest comes from structural advantages that took China more than a decade to build deliberately. Massive manufacturing scale, vertically integrated supply chains that control everything from raw lithium processing to the finished battery pack, and relentless year-over-year engineering cost reductions. Nowhere is that structural dominance clearer than in batteries themselves, the single most expensive component in any EV. As of mid-2026, Chinese firms collectively control roughly 72% of the entire global EV battery market. CATL alone, the largest of them, holds around 40% on its own, supplying not just Chinese automakers, but Tesla, BMW, and Volkswagen as well. CATL's operating margins have run around 18%. At the exact same time, several Korean competitors have posted outright losses trying to keep pace, 72%. That is not a company with a competitive advantage. That is a country holding something close to a structural monopoly over the core technology every electric vehicle on Earth depends on, regardless of which country's logo sits on the hood. What makes this so much more durable than a single company's success story is that the dominance runs several layers deep. Beneath KTL and BYD, a second tier of Chinese battery manufacturers, companies like Kalb, Gotion, Svolt, and Eve Energy are expanding into markets outside China at growth rates between roughly 70 and over 170% year on year, far outpacing the overall market. 7 of the world's top 10 EV battery makers by volume are now Chinese firms. That kind of depth means the advantage isn't fragile. It isn't a matter of catching one, company off guard, or out-innovating one lab. It's an entire domestic industrial base, from the mines that supply lithium and cobalt through to the finished battery packs going into vehicles on 5 continents, operating at a scale and cost structure that took over a decade of deliberate industrial policy to build, and that no single tariff or single competitor can meaningfully offset on its own. There's also a question worth sitting with here, because it explains why the American response so far has focused almost entirely on tariffs rather than matching the underlying technology. Believing subsidies were the primary threat led directly to a policy response built around tariffs, import bans, and industrial defensiveness. But if the real drivers are manufacturing scale and supply chain control, the way most independent analysts now argue they are, tariffs alone don't fix the underlying gap. They simply wall off one market while the rest of the world remains fully open to it. That's exactly the dynamic now playing out with pickup trucks specifically. The United States has successfully defended its home turf using the chicken tax. A BYD seal priced around $26,000 in China would need to retail near $52,000 in the US, once tariffs, compliance costs, and shipping are added. Pricing it directly against a Tesla Model 3 rather than the budget segment it dominates everywhere else. As of mid-2026, no Chinese EV brand sells a new passenger vehicle in the United States at all. But that same wall does nothing for Ford or GM in Bangkok, Sao Paulo, or Melbourne, the exact markets where the shark is now expanding, with virtually no equivalent tariff protection waiting for it there. This is the part of the story where it's worth pausing on what remains genuinely uncertain, because the picture is more complicated than a simple story of inevitable Chinese conquest. BYD's own battery installation numbers actually declined in parts of 2026 compared to the year before, driven largely by softer demand for its own branded vehicles inside China's intensely competitive domestic market. Even as the company kept expanding overseas, the shark has not been confirmed for a U.S. launch, and given the chicken tax's continued political durability under the current administration, there's no clear indication that will change soon. If anything, tariff policy in Washington has moved toward tightening restrictions on Chinese vehicles rather than loosening them, even as the president has expressed some openness to Chinese automakers building factories on American soil rather than exporting finished vehicles. The picture outside the U.S. is also shifting in ways that cut against a simple narrative of unstoppable Chinese advance. Canada, after imposing a full 100% tariff on Chinese-made vehicles amid a broader trade dispute with Washington, moved in 2026 to slash that rate down to just 6.1%, opening a path for BYD, Geely, and others to gain a foothold in North America through the Canadian market. Specifically, though even their regulators capped annual imports at 49,000 vehicles initially, rising slowly toward 70,000 over roughly 5 years, a deliberately managed opening rather than an unrestricted one. Meanwhile, the European Union has been weighing whether to lower its own tariffs on Chinese EVs, a decision still unresolved as of this year, that would either open or further restrict one of the largest remaining markets still partially shielded from full Chinese competition. Industry analysts have also cautioned that successfully breaking into the American market specifically, even without a chicken tax in the picture, would take Chinese automakers considerable time regardless. S&P Global Mobility analyst Stephanie Brinley has noted that establishing a sustainable U.S. foothold requires years of investment, patience, and the willingness to absorb costly product mistakes along the way. The same, slow climb Toyota and Hyundai each had to make decades earlier, even without today's added political resistance. It's also worth being precise about what coming for America's last advantage actually means in practice right now. Chinese pickup trucks are not, as of today, selling on American roads, and the F-150 is not losing U.S. market share to BYD. What's actually happening is narrower and, in some ways, more strategically significant. Detroit's profit margins in markets outside the U.S., markets that have historically subsidized Detroit's ability to compete at all, are now under direct pressure from a competitor building comparable trucks at a fraction of the cost in exactly the countries where no chicken tax exists to stop it. So where does that leave the Fortress America built around its most profitable vehicle category? The wall itself, at least for now, is holding domestically, reinforced rather than dismantled by the current political climate in Washington. But a fortress that only defends one border was never built to withstand a competitor operating everywhere else on the map at once. And that is the uncomfortable position Detroit finds itself in today, secure at home while quietly losing ground on every other front where the chicken tax has no jurisdiction at all. Ford and Toyota aren't losing the American truck market. They're being forced to defend a second front they never had to seriously fight for before, using a product built by a company that, a decade ago, barely exported outside its own borders and now controls, by itself, a meaningful share of the technology every electric vehicle on the planet is built around. Whether that pressure eventually reaches American shores through changed tariff or policy, through Chinese factories built on U.S. soil, or simply through the compounding weight of a battery supply chain increasingly outside anyone else's control, is the open question nobody in Detroit, Washington, or Beijing has fully answered yet. Tell me in the comments which fact stayed with you more, that a Chinese-made truck can pass for a Ford at a glance, or that China now controls roughly 70% of the batteries every electric vehicle on the planet depends on.